Money. Introduction. The phenomenal profit associated with the narcotics trade is the foundation upon which the cartel's power is based. Therefore, a concerted attack on the cartel's money laundering operations may be one of the most effective means to damage the international narcotics trade. The subcommittee heard testimony from a number of witnesses concerning the magnitude of money laundering. Those testifying ranged from narcotics traffickers who laundered drug profits to one of the Medellin cartel's money launderers to an authority on international banking. In reviewing this testimony, members of the subcommittee subsequently drafted money laundering legislation, which was incorporated into the Omnibus Drug Bill of 1988 and enacted into law in October 1988. Defining the problem of money laundering. The phrase money laundering has been used to describe a wide range of illegal financial operations. The most basic form of money laundering is the skimming of funds from cash-generating businesses to evade taxes. The Internal Revenue Service estimates that in 1988, some $50 billion was hidden in this way. The term is also used to describe schemes to hide the cash produced by a range of illegal activities, including illegal gambling, prostitution, and drug trafficking. Estimating the size of this underground economy is extremely difficult for obvious reasons. However, law enforcement officials have consistently estimated that these activities may generate as much as $100 billion in illicit cash profits each year in the United States. For the relatively small-time drug trafficker, the laundering of money is simple. They spend their profits. They pay the wages of accomplices and suppliers in cash, and they use cash to purchase luxury items such as cars, jewelry, and vacation homes. However, as one moves higher up the drug distribution hierarchy, the profits are so large that they cannot be completely hidden through consumption, and capital is retained. Holding capital in the form of currency is very costly. Not only are secure storage and transportation of currency prohibitively expensive, but also the opportunity costs in terms of lost earning power are substantial. These problems can be overcome only by depositing the money in a financial institution which takes custody of the currency, pays interest on the balances, and can transfer funds anywhere in the world through the use of electronic funds transfer system. The Bank Secrecy Act restricts money laundering. As the worldwide drug trade mushroomed during the 1970s, the United States became the center of money laundering activities. In response to this problem, the Bank Secrecy Law was enacted in 1974. The act requires that all cash transactions in excess of $10,000 must be reported monthly to the Internal Revenue Service, including bank and securities brokerage transactions, transactions in cash at casinos, real estate closings, and even automobile, boat, and aircraft purchases. Large shipments of cash into or out of the country must be reported as well. The reporting requirement was viewed as an essential step to prevent the proceeds of crime from being laundered. The requirement created a paper trail whereby law enforcement authorities could trace funds invested in legitimate enterprises to determine whether or not such funds had their origins in criminal activities. However, initial enforcement of the currency reporting requirements of the Bank Secrecy Act of 1974 proved to be lax, and significant sums of money continued to be laundered through U.S. financial institutions. Increased attention to the problem by the Treasury Department brought stricter enforcement efforts during the Reagan administration. These efforts included a much publicized prosecution in 1985 of the Bank of Boston and indictments of other financial institutions for accepting cash deposits of over $10,000 without reporting them in the IRS. In the wake of the stricter enforcement measures, the Treasury Department determined that financial institutions in the United States were increasingly complying with the reporting requirements. However, Treasury also recognized that as compliance increased in the United States, Those engaged in criminal activities were moving more and more U.S. currency overseas to countries whose banking regulations guaranteed that such transactions would remain secret. The international loophole. Testimony delivered before the subcommittee described in detail the movement of U.S. currency to be laundered in offshore banks and the methods used by both drug dealers and bankers to avoid regulation and detection. The profits from the international drug trade are moved to any country which guarantees the fewest problems for the trafficker in handling the proceeds from the illicit activities. As a result, drug money is moved to countries such as Panama, which do not collect taxes on foreign accounts and which provide the fewest restrictions on the movement of U.S. currency across their borders. The business has been highly competitive, attracting many smaller nations which historically have served as tax havens in order to attract capital from around the world. Among the principal money laundering tax havens have been the Bahamas, the Cayman Islands, Hong Kong, Liechtenstein, Luxembourg, Monaco, Nauru, Singapore, and the Turks and Caicos Islands. By the mid-1980s, Panama became an important center for the drug trade because it offered everything a trafficker needed. Panama is strategically located on the major route between the United States and South America. It has very stringent bank secrecy laws, and in the figure of General Noriega, guaranteed physical protection of money couriers moving currency to Panama. The use of these jurisdictions to launder drug money is described in the case histories below, selected from the subcommittee hearings. Evident in the case histories is the ease with which drug traffickers move money out of the United States to foreign jurisdictions for deposit, where, in turn, the funds can then be electronically transferred back into the United States. Case histories. Cayman Islands. Lee Rich, convicted of narcotics trafficking in 1986, ran one of the largest marijuana smuggling organizations ever uncovered in the United States. By the time he was 30 years old, Rich was transacting drug deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Rich told the subcommittee that all of his distributors paid him in cash, and that he stored the bills in a safe house in the Tampa, Florida area. He employed old high school friends to count and package the money for shipment to an offshore banking haven where the money could be converted into a bank deposit. For Rich, the ideal place was the Cayman Islands, renowned for its bank secrecy laws. Rich held dual U.S.-British citizenship and had lived and worked in the Cayman Islands. He had learned that the island's hundreds of financial institutions existed principally to assist Latin Americans in evading exchange controls and taxes in their own countries. These institutions would not require any information on deposits of large sums of U.S. currency. Rich testified that the Cayman banks charged a 1% fee for laundering the money, which they characterized as a fee for counting the cash. After taking such a fee, the banks would then ship the funds to the U.S. Federal Reserve System. When Rich first began selling narcotics, the amounts of currency he handled were in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. He would place the currency in a suitcase and fly from Tampa to the Cayman Islands. As the amounts of cash he handled grew and his trips became more frequent, Rich began to fear that his activities would be uncovered. As Rich put it, quote, "There was a lot of U.S. intelligence on the island, watching the airport, watching the bank transactions there." End quote. Rich also learned that Cayman banks were being pressured by the U.S. not to accept deposits from known drug traffickers. Accordingly, Rich decided to move his money to Panama. In Panama, Rich relied on his partner in the smuggling operation, Stephen Kalish, to act as his agent to deal with the Panamanians. Kalish actually bought a penthouse apartment in Panama City for use by the organization. He shuttled between Florida and Panama and, according to Rich, negotiated with General Noriega to ensure the security of the money laundering operation. Bahamas. Luis Kojak Garcia, a marijuana smuggler turned federal government informer, described the dimensions of the currency generated by his drug transactions by recounting how there were times he would sit in his spacious living room, ankle deep in $20, $50, and $100 bills. After receiving the money from distributors who paid him for the marijuana he smuggled into the Miami area, Garcia then paid his suppliers and members of his drug organization. He claims also to have paid several high-ranking Bahamian officials up to $250,000 for permission to transship marijuana through the Bahamas. These payments still left him with hundreds of thousands of dollars in currency at a time, which required laundering. Initially, Garcia used the Bahamian banking system to launder the profits from the narcotics business, particularly since he was already using the islands as the transit point for drugs coming into the United States. The Bahamas had strict bank secrecy laws, and there were no requirements for reporting the deposit of U.S. currency in Bahamian financial institutions. Garcia found that initially many Bahamian banks were more than willing to have his business. But like the rich Kalish organization, the Garcia organization found that increasing pressure by the U.S. was making the Bahamas a less attractive place to do business for money laundering. Accordingly, on the advice of Ramon Milian Rodriguez, a money launderer for the Medellin cartel, and a number of Cuban-American narcotics traffickers, Garcia decided to join the cartel, Rodriguez, and the rich Kalish organization in laundering his profits in Panama. Panama had grown into a money laundering center long before General Noriega came into power, in large part as a result of banking reforms instituted in the late 1960s. Bank secrecy laws were adopted and regulations on financial institutions repealed, which led to a virtual explosion in the Panamanian banking industry by the early 1970s. Dozens of foreign banks opened branches in Panama, many of them geared toward attracting the proceeds of illegal activity. By the early 1980s, there were well over 100 banks in Panama, and more than 50 of those were owned by Colombians. These banks attracted significant sums of drug money as the cartel's relationship with General Noriega grew. Panama became so successful in attracting drug money that, according to U.S. Treasury estimates, staggering sums of currency amounting to at least several billion dollars were being laundered each year. Panama's development as a money laundering center prior to 1984 is described more fully in the chapter on Panama. Amjad Awan, the former manager of the Bank of Credit and Commerce International Panama, stated in a subcommittee deposition that many of the international banks in Panama willingly laundered money. He said that when unusually large amounts of cash were returned from Panama to the Federal Reserve Bank in New York in 1984, the Panamanian Bankers Association, a self-regulatory organization, met to discuss how to deal with this problem. Voluntary limits on the amount of U.S. currency that any one bank could return to the National Bank of Panama were proposed. A suggested $5 million limit was vigorously protested by the Swiss banks and a number of large North American banks. When voluntary limits were adopted, the Swiss banks avoided compliance by chartering aircraft to fly currency back to Europe. Awan also stated that the bankers could get money laundering business by paying kickbacks of 1 or 2% to the owners of Brinks of Panama. According to Awan, Brinks controlled the placement of many drug deposits, and for a fee would direct the shipment of cash to the bank, which paid a commission. In addition, banks which laundered money tolerated cash skimming by officials of the National Bank of Panama when the money was transferred for repatriation. To offset these expenses and earn a substantial profit, the banks charged special cash handling fees for taking in large sums of currency. Marijuana smuggler Lee Rich confirmed this account. He testified that Cesar Rodriguez, a drug trafficker who worked for Noriega, had established a 2 to 3% fee for money laundering by his organization. The fee dropped to 1% for each deposit over $5 million. The services Cesar Rodriguez provided included meeting the shipments of money at the airport with armored cars, bodyguards, and limousines, and providing continuous personal security while the traffickers remained in Panama. Panama became so secure for money laundering that the principal problem for the drug traffickers was security for the money as it left the United States, not once it reached Panama. To solve this problem, the cartel experimented with different methods of handling funds in order to prevent seizures. Often, the money was flown to Panama as commercial air freight on either Braniff Airlines or Eastern Airlines. Currency was shipped in pallets or in containers. The use of palletized shipments was confirmed by an Eastern pilot who testified that after his plane landed in Panama, he watched pallets being unloaded from his craft into waiting armored cars. When he inquired as to the nature of the cargo, he was informed that it was money. According to Roman Milian Rodriguez, the station managers for the airlines were in the employ of General Noriega, thus ensuring that the currency cargoes received special protection. Noriega also maintained an ownership interest in the armored car business that met the planes at the airport. After being laundered, many of the drug profits of the cartel deposited in Panamanian financial institutions found their way back to Colombia, where they were invested in newspapers, radio stations, television stations, soccer teams, pharmaceutical firms, automobile agencies, and construction companies. One money launderer's experience. In his subcommittee testimony, Milian Rodriguez described his career as a money launderer and explained the techniques used by the major traffickers to handle and invest their money. As an accountant in Miami, Milian Rodriguez attracted business from members of the Cuban exile community who had turned from shell fishing to drug trafficking during the 1970s. Beginning on a modest scale, Milian Rodriguez took the responsibility for counting, packaging, and shipping his clients' money to Panama, where the funds were deposited in a local bank. Typically, Rodriguez set up the account at the Panamanian Bank in the name of a Panamanian corporation created for the sole purpose of receiving the one-time currency deposit. Shortly after the initial deposit, the money would then be moved to another group of accounts in the same bank through a cash withdrawal in the form of a teller's receipt. This transaction did not leave a paper trail to the receiving accounts. The money would then be moved to a second bank in the form of teller's notes and deposited to the account of another group of dummy Panamanian corporations, further hiding the source of the funds. From there, it was transferred to a visible and, on the surface, legitimate investment corporation in the Netherlands Antilles. That corporation would in turn purchase a wide range of assets as passive investments, including luxury real estate, stocks and bonds, and other financial instruments. Milian Rodriguez testified that in 1979, he established a cash management system for Pablo Escobar, a key figure in the Medellin cartel. Milian Rodriguez designed this system to maximize profit and interest and minimize risk. As he described it, currency received from wholesale cocaine purchases was delivered to cartel operatives in the major cities around the United States. These cutouts, in turn, passed the money to messengers who delivered it to safe houses, where Colombians counted and bundled the money and shipped it to consolidation points for shipment to Panama. The packaging and shipment of currency was handled by freight forwarding companies owned by the cartel. Milian Rodriguez provided the subcommittee with cardboard boxes that had been designed to exact dimensions for packing money and carried the logo of the captive freight forwarder. Milian Rodriguez was convicted under federal RICO statutes as a money launderer and sentenced to 43 years in federal prison. In May 1983, he was arrested with $5.4 million in cash as he attempted to leave Fort Lauderdale for Panama on his personal Lear jet. At the time of his arrest, federal authorities touted him as the biggest drug money launderer apprehended in Florida. The U.S. response to the problem. By the time the Subcommittee on Narcotics and Terrorism began its investigation, the use of offshore banks by drug traffickers already had received significant attention by Congress. Beginning in 1982, the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations of the Senate Government Affairs Committee undertook a major investigation of the use of banks, trusts, and companies in offshore bank secrecy jurisdictions by drug runners. In the case of Panama, the subcommittee concluded that, quote, the evidence indicates that a significant percentage of the currency in circulation in Panama was drug money, end quote. In the House of Representatives, Congressman George Wortley, Republican, New York, a member of the Banking Committee, introduced a proposal which would have authorized the Treasury Secretary to subject a wide range of foreign financial institutions, including branches, subsidiaries, and affiliates of institutions doing business in the United States, to the record-keeping and reporting requirements of the Bank Secrecy Act. The House Banking Committee included this proposal in H.R. 5176, the money laundering bill that it reported in August 1986. According to the committee report, H.R. Report Number 746, 99th Congress, 2nd Session, 34, quote, by including Section 6A in the bill, the committee's intent is to send a clear and unmistakable message that it expects United States financial institutions doing business in this country to not only abide by the letter of the law, but to live up to their moral responsibility to fully cooperate in this country's efforts to stamp out the illicit trafficking of drugs, end quote. Foreign governments, bankers, and the Treasury Department opposed the Wortley provision from becoming a part of the final drug bill passed by the Congress in 1986, arguing that it represented an unprecedented extraterritorial application of U.S. law. A substitute provision was included, Section 1363, subsection C, which required the Secretary of the Treasury to report to Congress within 1 year on the extent to which foreign branches are used to facilitate money laundering to evade the reporting requirements of the Bank Secrecy Act, to examine the issue of extraterritoriality, and to identify methods of obtaining the cooperation of foreign governments. In July 1987, the Treasury Secretary submitted his report to Congress. In the report, he stated that, quote, Treasury is aware of very few examples of Bank Secrecy Act or money laundering cases involving transfers through foreign branches of United States financial institutions, end quote. The Secretary further noted that, quote, because there is no accurate means of determining how much money is laundered through each type of financial institution, Treasury can offer no reliable estimates on the amount of money that may be laundered through foreign branches of domestic financial institutions, end quote. Effectiveness of current reporting requirements. In the wake of indictments of a number of prominent U.S. financial institutions for their failure to abide by the reporting requirements of the Bank Secrecy Act, the Congress in 1986 made it a crime to deposit large sums of cash without providing basic information about the depositor, such as name, address, and taxpayer identification. This statute applies to every bank, broker, and financial institution in the country, including casinos that handle large sums of cash. Depositor information, or currency transaction reports, CTR, are now being filed at a rate of nearly 600,000 a month. The 1986 law and the data generated by CTRs have begun to pay off. More than 270 targets of suspicious activity have been identified, and there have been several major prosecutions, including the well-known Washington, D.C. and New York City Pizza Connection case, in which a number of persons were convicted in a major heroin smuggling operation. But while these laws have been extremely effective in fighting distributors of illegal narcotics in the United States, A major loophole has made them entirely ineffective against drug smugglers who operate from foreign sanctuaries. As the subcommittee testimony detailed, the drug traffickers have developed systems to ship the money generated by drug sales out of the U.S. for deposit in countries with strict bank secrecy laws, and then electronically transfer these funds back to the United States, where they are lawfully invested in income-producing assets. Summary and conclusions. To function, the criminal organizations which control the drug business must have access to commercial banks willing to take large amounts of U.S. currency anonymously. Moreover, they must be able to keep secret the identity of the beneficial owners of the secret accounts. Restricting these two essential requirements for successful money laundering activities, even imperfectly, is the most important action the United States government can take in challenging seriously the operations of the large traffickers. The Subcommittee on Narcotics and Terrorism therefore proposed that the Secretary of the Treasury negotiate agreements permitting foreign banks to cooperate with U.S. narcotics investigations. As a result of an amendment sponsored by the chairman and ranking member of the subcommittee, Senator John F. Kerry and Senator Mitch McConnell, legislation incorporating this proposal was included in the Omnibus Drug Bill passed at the close of the 100th Congress, after passing the Senate by a vote of 85-3. All banks, both U.S. and foreign-owned, which do business in the United States, should be required to record U.S. cash deposits in excess of $10,000 as a condition of their U.S. charter or their right to transfer funds electronically into this country. The prompt negotiations of such agreements with other countries, as mandated by the Omnibus Drug Bill of 1988, should be undertaken. It is the belief of the members of the subcommittee that these agreements will ensure that banks maintain a record on the identity of anyone who conducts a cash transaction in excess of $10,000. The records of such transactions would be requested only in connection with a narcotics investigation. Institutions which choose not to comply with this requirement should be denied access to the U.S. banking market and the financial wire transfer network maintained by the Federal Reserve. This is Our Hidden History.